While there are a bunch of different hypothesis tests we can run, every hypothesis test we do in this class will always revolve around the same 5 steps. Our steps are always 1, list, 2, hypothesis, 3, test statistic, 4, p-value, and 5, our conclusion. Now, the easiest way to start understanding hypothesis tests is to imagine that we're running a trial by a jury. Before the trial ever starts, the first thing everyone does is gather the evidence they have. This is our first step with list. This is where we list all of our evidence and all the information we have about the test we're going to run. Once evidence is gathered, the next thing that happens is the person shows up before a jury. In the beginning of a trial, there's a common assumption that's made, in fact required to be made, and that is, in the very beginning of the trial, we assume the person is innocent. This is what's called our null hypothesis. This is the assumption we run on, which is like assuming the person is innocent. It's important to realize that during a trial, the entire time, you're supposed to still assume that person's innocent and then weigh the evidence you're getting against that. H0 is the assumption the jury makes. Assuming the person's innocent, it's called, once again, the null hypothesis. Now, the trial isn't being run to prove the person's innocent, but rather to prove the opposite of that, to prove they're guilty. And this is what we're going to be doing with what's called our alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is what we assume, like innocence. The alternative hypothesis is what we're trying to prove. We write our alternative hypothesis as H sub A. And once again, this is what we're trying to prove. Such as trying to prove that the person is actually guilty. Once we make this assumption, once we assume the person's innocent, then the trial starts to go underway. And what happens during the trial is all the evidence is presented and the people consider it. This is what happens with the test statistic. This is where our evidence is presented. The test statistic will actually be a measure of how much evidence there is. That is, how far from expectation are we? This is like saying, okay, I'm assuming the person's innocent. Well, how far is all this evidence away from the expectation of innocence? That is, okay, so they're holding a knife. Well, that's pretty far away. Okay, they're holding a knife and covered in blood. Well, that's really far away. So once again, all of that is with the test statistic, where the evidence is presented. After the evidence is presented, the next thing that happens is the jury considers whether or not the person is innocent or not. That's what happens during the p-value. The p-value is the probability of all of this evidence if our assumption is true. That's like saying, if he's really innocent, what are the chances he was holding the knife? So this is what the p-value measures. That is, what's the probability of having all this evidence if in fact our assumption is actually true? If in fact he's innocent, what are the chances this evidence is here? This weighing of the evidence is actually what's going to decide what our conclusion is. So, giving ourselves a little more room here. We can start to talk about our conclusion statement. Now, the key here is where our cutoff is. So that is, you've got all this evidence, how do you decide to charge a guy as guilty or not? For instance, if there's a 25% chance that he's not guilty, do you still send him to jail? Probably not. What about a 10% chance he's not guilty? Probably not still. How about a 5% or a 1% chance he's still innocent? Well, that cutoff point in statistics is what we call our significance level. And the significance level we tend to use is 0.05. And what this means is that we're cutting it off at a 5% chance. That is, We're saying, well, if he's actually innocent, there's only a 5% chance this would happen. So he looks really guilty at that point. In this way, 0.05 is the cutoff we use. We say if our p-value is less than 0.05, that is, if there's less than a 5% chance of that happening, we reject our assumption. That is, in this case, we're rejecting the idea that he's innocent. If we're rejecting the idea that he's innocent, that means guilty. Now, on the other hand, we might end up with a p-value greater than 0.05. And what this means is that the chance that this evidence would be here if the person is innocent is more than 5%. So maybe there's a 10% chance it happens, or a 30, or a 40, or a 50% chance it happens. In this case, we fail to reject our assumption, and it's important to realize why. If we're performing a trial by jury, there's only two conclusions that can be reached. For instance, the person can be found guilty, or, really important, the person can be found not guilty. We never conclude someone's actually innocent. In fact, we'd say they're not guilty, and the reason for that is, well, there's just not enough evidence to find them guilty. In hypothesis testing, we can reject our assumption, that is, we can reject this idea up here, but we can never actually accept that. We never prove someone's innocent. We just say, well, there's not enough evidence to prove otherwise. These will be the 5 steps we run with any hypothesis test we do. We'll just switch what we put in each little step.